since I was a kid, I was drawn to the spirit world, the unseen, the weird stuff. Not so much to the occult and stuff, but I like to investigate and read and try to find out the best I could when I was younger. Uh, my question was, what drawn you personally to start exploring this, to start going this route? Like, did you have some supernatural experiences, or maybe they were happening in your family or with your friends? What made you to say, okay, I would like to start investigating, I would like to start an organization, and eventually write books about this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, honestly, and this isn't necessarily what people want to hear, but if it wasn't for the experiences I've had in my life, I probably wouldn't be very interested in most of this stuff. I might not take it very seriously at all, frankly. But starting at a very young age, I have had a series of experiences throughout my life that defy explanation. It started when I was very young. Some of my earliest memories, just fragments of memories, really are of being terrified of going to bed because I knew when I did that something was going to be coming for me, and having the covers pulled over my head and seeing hands pressing on them from the outside, or waking up to feel something digging painfully into my ribs, or feeling as though I'm being carried away. And as I got older, those events didn't stop. They continued, but I was just able to remember them better as as I got older, right? And my brain developed and my mind developed, and I was more capable of forming cohesive memories. Because again, like these memories, when I say very young, I mean 2, 3, 4 years old is when these started. Um, and so as I went through life, I had continued experiences with nighttime visitations, beings that had a variety of appearances. One of which would be the sort of traditional gray alien. I think that people are very accustomed to now. Um, but it wasn't just that, seeing things like shadow people or hearing voices. Of, like I said, really a variety of weird experiences. I can give you in example of one that was particularly impactful, and this happened when I was in my early 20s, and so I have a very a good remembrance of this. Like the memory of it is very clear. And I lived with my parents at that time, and I had gone to bed normally one night, and I remember waking up, and there was no obvious stimulus that should have woken me up then, right? And I looked around, and we lived in the suburbs, and so there was some light coming in through the window, just the ambient light of the suburbs, right? And so while it wasn't very bright in my room, I could definitely make out the silhouettes of everything in there. And as my eyes adjusted, I could see things even better. And I again found myself very suddenly and inexplicably awake, and naturally I looked around to see if something had just woken me up. And it took me a second because everything seemed off, right? But I realized after a few seconds that my perspective was skewed, and that seemed to be because I was floating several feet above my bed. And so I could move. I wasn't paralyzed or anything, but I decided in that moment that it probably wasn't a very good idea for me to move, at least not very much. And so I moved my head around to look and sort of see what was going on. And I looked to my left, and I saw this figure, this black figure, shaped like a human man, other than being completely devoid of all detail and just solid black. And I had the distinct impression that I probably wasn't supposed to be awake for this. And so I looked at this thing, whatever it was, and when I did that, it reached its hand out and put its hand on my chest. And I always interpreted that as being sort of a comforting gesture, but I don't really know. I couldn't possibly, right? I can only speculate as to the actual motivation there. But when it put its hand on my chest, I was lowered back down to my bed, and then it just suddenly vanished, and it was gone. And so I was lying there, noticeably on top of my covers, right? And I certainly hadn't gone to sleep that way. And I just lied there for a while, and at that point, you know, I had experienced so many things like this in my life that I didn't panic. You know, people always ask me like, weren't you terrified? Like, why didn't you get up and run around screaming or something? And I got to tell you, at that point, well before then, really, I had learned that waking my parents up didn't do any good. Like, what were they going to do? They didn't take it super seriously at that time, and really, that just was a good way to make them grumpy. And I wasn't hurt. You know, if I was going to be physically hurt, I would have been by then, right? If these things wanted to hurt me, they could have hurt me any time. And so it didn't seem like I was in danger or anything, right? And so I just laid there and thought about what had happened, and then after a while, I just got back under the covers and went back to sleep. But yeah, that was an example of something that has happened to me throughout my life, and you know, I've examined it or tried to skeptically, right? Um, I had to rule out like a dream. I had to rule out sleep paralysis. You know, none of those explanations really fit very well. And so, what am I left with, right? Something inexplicable, something mysterious, and it's because of that or those kinds of events that I'm interested in this field. You know, like I said, if it wasn't for stuff like that, I'd probably still be pretty nerdy, but I don't know that I would be so interested in this stuff, because if you haven't experienced it, um, due to the lack of physical evidence for most of it, it does seems pretty out there, and it can be very difficult for people to believe who haven't been through it, and I don't blame them. Frankly, I don't blame them one bit. But you know, having experienced that kind of stuff, I have no choice but to want to investigate further and to try to help other people who have experienced similar things.
I appreciate you sharing, you know, your private story. I just want to say that when I read your book, well, I didn't read it all, but I read probably 80% or so because I only had a few days. What I appreciate the most of your book is your intellectual honesty. When you're sure about something, you try to give so much detail and data and evidence, people's names, location, time, whatever. Where you're not sure, you're saying these people didn't pick up the phone, they're scared or didn't want to reveal too much. This is what they told me, or they said initially they would like to have interviewed, then you know they gave up. I cannot assume what is behind that. Or even when you pile up all the data, you say, you know, I'm not sure what this being could be. It could be this. It could be this. I'm not sure. I'm not just gonna assume. So throughout the whole book, I keep seeing this, and I'm like, yes. I'm like, this is how, in general, professional research should be in academia or outside academia, and it doesn't even matter what is the topic. And I'm like, oh, I just like your approach because you're not trying to push your bias. You're not trying to do this. At least I didn't perceive it that way. I'm gonna try to like advertise this because I made this, so I'm gonna sell it.